if you could start by introducing yourself and reflecting a bit on what you feel is the core challenge facing aid.
Great. Well, it's great to be able to do this, Taylor. This is, to introduce myself, I'm George Roeder. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Engineers Without Borders Canada, an organization that is new to the international development world, or at least relatively new. We started 10 years ago, and really our goal is to bring a new approach to how development is done in a very systemic way. In terms of the biggest challenge, I think that it really relates to what our role is and what our role has emerged as in the international development space with Engineers Without Borders. We've really had people, as you can imagine, lots of engineers embedded right on the ground, mainly in Africa. And one of the things that we've seen over the years is that right now the way that aid is practiced, particularly in a development context, is probably best described with a metaphor of a construction project. If you're going to throw up a mall or you're going to throw up a condominium tower, you plan that out and gather the financing, put together the plans, hire the rough plans, hire the architects, hire the engineers. Those plans get turned into more detailed plans. The various different contractors get hired. They start work. Perhaps there's a few setbacks, but more or less there's a linear progression from the time that the shovel goes in the ground to the time when you, at the end of the day, have a gleaming either skyscraper or building that's done at the end of the day. And then you basically hand it over to whoever runs it or whoever becomes a tenant, and the project is done. And it's a very similar type of thing in international development right now with aid, where projects are conceived oftentimes quite far away from the ground by effectively developers. And in many cases, these are our governments, like the Canadian government, or large foundations or entities like the World Bank. And then basically all of the structures within aid are plotted out in a similar type of way, where you develop the plans, hire an architect, hire the people who are going to deliver the project, make the money and financing available, deliver the project over a period of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And then once the project is done, it's wrapped up, and in theory you hand the keys to the unit to various people who are going to be using that. And what we've seen with Engineers Without Borders is that very kind of linear progression of causation actually doesn't work very well when human beings are involved, when economies are involved, when different cultures are involved, when the aid and development process itself is actually a process of interacting with a fairly complex array of different systems.
So what's your response then to getting away from that linearity? So how can we move from what that linear production model to something that sounds like it's much more multifaceted, networked over different spaces and different times? And I mean, how do we move to that model?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot to it. Perhaps it's probably valuable for me to talk a little bit about an example that we see on the ground. So one of the areas where we've done a lot of work is in Malawi, in the water sector. And a water project sounds like a typical project. It actually sounds like a construction project, right? That over a period of 2 or 3 years, you ought to be able to actually plan out and say, we're going to drill 100 wells in 100 different communities, and more or less, 50,000 people are going to have access to clean water who didn't have access to clean water before. And it sounds like a simple endeavor.
Like a construction project.
Like a construction project. But one of the things that we've seen when we're on the ground is when you actually look at broad functionality rates of water infrastructure that's been implemented using that method in Malawi, the broad functionality rates range from about 50% to 70%. So up to in some cases 50% of all the infrastructure that's been installed in a reasonable period of time is sitting there not used, either because it's in the wrong place or because it's broken, and largely because the project was funded and delivered in a very linear way. A very specific example, we were actually engaged with a project funded by the Canadian government, a very large project funded by the Canadian government. And one of the biggest innovations that we can see is really demonstrated through what went wrong with this project, where a couple of years into it, 2 or 3 years into it, they realized that it was going off the rails, and both the design of how the water systems were going to be built, and also all of the systems to be able to support that water system at the end of the day through maintenance, through the involvement of local government and local governance activities. All of that wasn't being invested in sufficiently. And it was recognized at about the 2 or 3 year mark. But the structures within the aid system weren't present to be able to actually change course. And so one of the things that we've really started to do within Engineers Without Borders is start to ask the question, what allows a project like that to change course? And part of it, we believe, is even just cultural. So one of the things that we've seen within organizations that are really good at changing course is that they have the characteristics of inherent learning, where they believe that everything they're doing and every step that they're taking moving forward is actually a hypothesis, and that hypothesis may be right or it may be wrong. And to be able to admit when that hypothesis is wrong is actually an important part of being able to learn from it. Yeah. And right now I would say that the development industry and the aid industry is very hesitant to admit failure. So what we've done with EWB is we publish an annual failure report along with a traditional success report every single year. We think that could be a very interesting leverage point to have a variety of different aid organizations who are involved in this start to learn and start to be more flexible in the way that they deliver aid by being much more open about both what's working and what's not.
Is the donor community funding these projects open to those course corrections mid-project?
It's a great question. I would say today the answer is no. I would say that right now there needs to be a fairly substantial investment in helping Canadians and those who are actually funding these projects, whether they are citizenry within various countries or whether they are they're large foundations or those at the World Bank, to actually have them start to understand that there's a lot of complexity in development, and that it requires a lot of patience and a lot of flexibility. And I don't, there's a lot of people who argue that say, you know what, Canadians can't understand this. All they want to know, they want to donate a goat or donate a bed net, and they want to see a direct causal relationship between the actions they or their government takes and the results. And I honestly just don't buy that. I don't buy that argument that Canadians aren't smart enough and aren't willing to be engaged enough in understanding that there's a complexity with this type of work. They see it every day in their lives. They realize that when they send their son or daughter off to school in the morning to go to class, and they do that for 10 years and they offer love and kindness, those kids may or may not learn a lot in school. And there's a lot of different factors that are going to affect whether they learn or how they learn. And there's a similar type of sort of non-linearity associated with lots of things in our lives. And so I think we need to start that conversation about what it takes to have really effective aid, and to have countries like Canada be able to support that in a smart and systemic way.
It sounds like this is pretty heavily influenced by the thinking of an engineer. scientific method and experimentation and hypotheses and changing experiments mid-course. And is that something EWB brings to the conversation?
I think it is, although ironically, I think that one of the great, if not failures or weaknesses of engineers is that they have tended to like really nice, clean, neat answers at the end of the day.
Right.
So, something has a number that you can quantify at the end of the day.
Right.
And in a lot of instances, I think that part of what we've had to do with our mindset, and perhaps this is why I'm so confident that Canadians will be able to do this, is we've had to change our mindset as engineers engaged in development to realize that that at the end of the day, sometimes numbers are as important as the qualitative story behind those, and sometimes being able to actually measure something is not possible, certainly in the short term, and so you need to make guesses as to what works. And a great example of that is investing in human capital. One of the other things that we see, to just take the Malawi water example again, is you go on the ground and these projects that are implemented are very large. And in fact, 10 times the amount of funds are invested in project type activities that last 3 years or so, as compared to being invested in the human capital of the local Malawian government in the water sector. So that's, for every dollar that's invested in long-term capability building in the government, there's $10 invested in a short-term type of project. And the reason is because on a short-term project, you can touch and feel the results tomorrow. Whereas 10 years from now, those results might not be around, but if you were to invest that money in the human capital side and really do it in a very intelligent way, you would start to see some of those results.
Wow. Well, thanks so much, George, for speaking about this and for the contributions you're making to this conversation.
Thanks a lot, Taylor.
Take care.